What happens when a gang of racist bikers picks a fight with the wrong soldiers? At a quiet gas station, what began as taunts aimed at the soldiers, especially the black servicemen among them, quickly escalated into something much more dangerous. Stick around for this gripping tale of discipline, justice, and a fight that the bikers never saw coming. And let us know in the comments section where you are watching from. The humid South Carolina air clung to Staff Sergeant Ryan Cooper as he pulled his black Chevy Tahoe into the dimly lit Pine Ridge Gas and Go. The gas station was a quiet blip on the side of Highway 29, a place Ryan hadn't visited in years. For him and his 3 fellow soldiers, Sergeant Anthony Carter, Specialist Jason Gwynn, and Corporal Marcus Turner, it marked one of the final stops before home. Ryan stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he glanced up at the flickering neon sign. After 12 months in Iraq, even this modest sight felt like a luxury. His thoughts were on his wife, Lauren, and his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe. In his pocket, he carried a crayon, drawing Chloe had sent him during deployment. It showed their family smiling in front of their house, with "Come home soon, Daddy," scrawled in big, wobbly letters. "Feels good to be back," Marcus said, stretching his arms. His sharp eyes scanned the station's surroundings, a habit honed by countless nights on patrol. "It does," Ryan replied, his tone calm but reflective. The U.S. flag patch on his uniform caught the light as he leaned into his Tahoe to grab his wallet. One last stop, and then home. The steady hum of the gas pump filled the humid evening air as Ryan Cooper leaned against his truck, the cool metal grounding him. The numbers on the pump ticked upward, but his mind wasn't on the cost of gas. He was thinking about home, Lauren's warm smile, Chloe's excited squeal when she saw him walk through the door. It had been 12 long months overseas, and in just a few hours, he'd finally be where he belonged. "Not much longer now," Marcus Turner said, leaning against the truck beside him. Marcus had been Ryan's closest friend since basic training. Like Ryan, he was a black soldier who carried the pride and burden of wearing the uniform in a world that didn't always respect what it stood for. Ryan gave a small smile. "Yeah, feels surreal, doesn't it?" Marcus nodded, looking toward the gas station's dim neon sign. Almost too quiet, the low rumble of engines in the distance interrupted their conversation. At first, it was faint, blending with the steady chirp of cicadas in the humid air. But as the sound grew louder, it became distinct, a menacing, guttural roar that vibrated through the ground. 8 motorcycles appeared on the horizon, their headlights slicing through the dusk as they veered off the highway and into the gas station lot. The riders parked haphazardly in a staggered line, their large, chrome-plated bikes gleaming under the flickering lights. The men dismounted with purpose, each clad in worn leather vests adorned with patches. SC. Ryan recognized the name immediately. The gang had a reputation for stirring up trouble in small towns, thriving on intimidation and picking fights they knew they could win. The leader, a towering man with a thick, grizzled beard, removed his helmet and shook out his hair. His sharp, predatory eyes scanned the lot, landing on the soldiers like a hawk spotting prey. A slow, mocking grin spread across his face. Well, he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the station. "What do we have here?" "Uncle Sam's little pets." Ryan stiffened slightly, but kept his expression neutral. His military training kicked in, assessing the situation without giving away any emotion. Behind him, Anthony Carter and Jason Gwynn exchanged quick glances, their postures subtly shifting into readiness. They didn't want a confrontation, but if one came, they were prepared. "Keep it cool," Ryan murmured softly to his team. "Didn't know the army let just anyone in these days," sneered one of the bikers, a wiry man named Viper. He leaned against his bike, lighting a cigarette with exaggerated slowness. His sharp eyes zeroed in on Ryan and Marcus, his smirk growing. "Guess they're lowering the standards, huh? Letting in whoever they can scrape off the bottom of the barrel." Ryan's grip on the gas pump tightened briefly, but he forced himself to remain calm. He wasn't here for a fight, he was here to get home. Another biker, a broad-shouldered man named Tank, stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Looks like they're handing out those uniforms to just about anyone now," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. He pointed at the U.S. flag patch on Ryan's shoulder. "You sure you didn't buy that at a surplus store, boy?" Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but the fire in his eyes betrayed his calm tone. The leader, Brick, chuckled as he walked toward Ryan and Marcus. "Relax, boys. No need to get all worked up. We're just saying what everyone's thinking. You're not exactly what comes to mind when I think of American heroes." His grin widened, his voice mocking as he added, "But I guess even the Army's gotta meet their quotas, right?" Jason, who had been leaning against the truck, straightened up, his normally easygoing demeanor replaced by a hard stare. "You might want to watch your mouth," he said, his tone razor sharp. "Oh, look at this," Viper drawled, exhaling a puff of smoke. "The whole squad's got something to prove. Tell me, what's it like carrying these two? Bet they slow you down." Ryan took a slow, steadying breath, his mind racing through his options. He could feel Marcus tense beside him, ready to lash out. The insults were more than just words. They were cuts meant to provoke, meant to tear down the pride they wore on their sleeves, on their uniforms. "You know," Brick continued, stepping even closer to Ryan, "you boys should be thanking us. Guys like you don't get a lot of chances to look this good in public. That flag," he jabbed a finger toward Ryan's shoulder patch, "doesn't mean the same thing on you as it does on someone like me." The weight of those words hit Ryan hard. They weren't just insulting his service. They were insulting everything he and Marcus had fought to overcome, everything they stood for. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the anger coiling tightly. But he didn't move. He couldn't, not yet. "Let's just grab what we need and go," Ryan said finally, his voice calm but firm. He turned to Marcus, giving him a small, meaningful nod. "It's not worth it." But as they turned toward the store, Brick's voice rang out again, louder this time, meant to make sure everyone heard. "Go ahead and walk away. That's what you're good at, isn't it? Running off when the real fight starts." Ryan stopped in his tracks. He could feel every muscle in his body tense, his mind running through every scenario. He wanted to turn around, to shut them up, to make them regret every word. But the thought of Lauren's smile, of Chloe's drawing, kept him steady. "Not today," he whispered to himself, more a reminder than a declaration. The bikers' laughter followed them as they walked into the gas station, the tension hanging heavy in the humid night air. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The soldiers moved into the gas station convenience store, their quiet camaraderie filling the aisles as they grabbed snacks and drinks for the road. The bikers followed, spreading out like they owned the place. Their loud voices and mocking laughter echoed through the small store, but it was Brick who made the first move. "Nice patch you got there," Brick said, stepping into Ryan's path and pointing at the U.S. flag patch on his shoulder. "Bet you think that means something, huh?" "It does," Ryan replied evenly, keeping his voice steady. Brick chuckled darkly and leaned closer. "Not to me, it doesn't. Guys like you don't deserve to wear it." Jason froze mid-reach for a bottle of water, his usually easygoing expression hardening. Marcus took a step forward, but Ryan raised a hand to stop him. "Let it go," Ryan said quietly, though his eyes never left Brick. But Brick wasn't done. He grabbed the flag patch and yanked at it, tugging hard enough to tear the stitching slightly. "What's it worth to you, huh? You think you're a hero?" His voice grew louder, his words dripping with venom. "Your buddies who didn't make it back. Maybe it's better they're gone. At least they don't have to pretend this country cares about people like you." The store seemed to go silent. Even the buzzing of the fluorescent lights faded into the background. Ryan's gaze locked onto Brick, his calm demeanor shifting ever so slightly. Marcus, Anthony, and Jason knew that look. They'd seen it before, right before a dangerous situation reached its tipping point. "Brick," one of the other bikers muttered nervously, sensing the change in the air. Ryan took a deliberate step back, creating space. "You've got one chance," he said, his voice low and steady. "Walk away. Now." Brick laughed, but it sounded forced. "Or what, soldier boy? There's 8 of us and 4 of you." Marcus smirked. "You might want to do the math again." The soldiers stood their ground, their calm demeanor masking the fire beginning to build beneath the surface. It was clear the bikers weren't going to let this go, and Ryan Cooper could feel the tension snap like a taut wire the moment Brick took one deliberate step forward. Brick's fists clenched at his sides, his face twisting into a sneer. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, his voice echoing through the small store. Without waiting for a response, he charged, his massive frame barreling toward Ryan like a freight train. Ryan moved instinctively. He sidestepped Brick's wild swing with the precision of a soldier who had dodged far worse threats in far more dangerous places. As Brick stumbled forward, overcommitting his weight, Ryan grabbed his arm, twisting it into a lock. With one smooth motion, he used Brick's own momentum against him, sweeping his legs out from under him and sending the leader crashing to the floor. The impact was thunderous, shaking the rack of chips nearby. Brick groaned, trying to rise, but Ryan stayed calm, his boot hovering just inches from the man's chest, a silent warning. "Stay down," Ryan said, his voice even, his eyes cold. Across the store, Anthony Carter had his own battle brewing. Tank, a mountain of a man with fists like sledgehammers, smirked as he stepped closer, cracking his knuckles loudly. "Let's see what you got, tough guy," he growled, throwing a haymaker that could have knocked out a lesser man. Anthony ducked effortlessly, the punch sailing past him. Without missing a beat, he pivoted low, sweeping Tank's legs out from under him. The big man toppled backward into the glass cooler door with a crash, bottles of soda rattling violently inside. Tank tried to get up, but Anthony pressed a firm hand against his shoulder, pinning him down. "You should have stayed outside," Anthony muttered, his voice calm but firm. Viper, always the wild card, drew a small switchblade from his belt with a flourish, the blade catching the fluorescent light as he grinned at Jason Gwynn. "Come on, medic," he taunted, waving the blade with erratic, exaggerated movements. "Let's see if you can patch yourself up after this." Jason didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on Viper's hands, tracking every erratic twitch. When the biker lunged, Jason moved with lightning speed, sidestepping and trapping Viper's wrist in a firm grip. A sharp twist and a perfectly placed elbow strike sent the knife clattering to the floor. Before Viper could react, Jason drove him backward into a rack of candy bars, the shelves clattering to the floor in a chaotic mess of wrappers and broken display signs. "Hope you like chocolate," Jason quipped, his grip on Viper unyielding. Marcus Turner had no time for banter. Two bikers advanced on him simultaneously, one swinging a wooden bat he'd grabbed from a shelf, the other aiming for a full-force tackle. Marcus moved like water, fluid and deliberate. He sidestepped the tackle, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back in one swift motion. With a sharp push, he sent the first attacker stumbling into the second biker, whose bat swung wildly and narrowly missed his partner. Marcus seized the opportunity, delivering a precise kick to the bat, knocking it from the biker's hands. A quick series of blocks and counterstrikes followed, as Marcus redirected their momentum into each other, sending them both crashing into a shelf of motor oil. "You're going to need a lot more than that," Marcus said, his breathing steady as he watched them writhe in the slick mess they'd created. The soldiers moved as a single unit, their synergy honed through countless hours of combat drills and real-world operations. Each man anticipated the other's movements, their unspoken coordination evident in how seamlessly they controlled the chaos. Ryan threw a quick glance at Marcus to ensure he was holding his ground. Behind him, Jason gave a brief nod, signaling that Viper was no longer a threat. Anthony stepped away from Tank, who was groaning on the floor, but clearly out of the fight. The bikers, outnumbering the soldiers, but hopelessly outmatched, were beginning to realize their mistake. The bravado they'd carried into the gas station was now reduced to groans and shouts of frustration. Brick, still on the floor, glared up at Ryan with fury in his eyes. "You think this is over?" he snarled, struggling to sit up. Ryan knelt down, just close enough for Brick to hear him. "It was over before it started," he said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Brick flinch. The fight had lasted less than a minute, but the aftermath was clear. The once pristine aisles of the gas station were now littered with fallen bikers, broken shelves, and spilled snacks. The soldiers, however, stood unscathed, their breaths steady, their movements controlled. Earl, the elderly clerk, peeked out from behind the counter, his wide eyes taking in the scene. He didn't say anything, but the small nod he gave Ryan spoke volumes. He'd seen a lot in his time, but this was something else entirely. The faint wail of sirens grew louder in the distance, signaling the arrival of law enforcement. Ryan straightened up, his team falling into step behind him. Together they stood tall, a quiet, unshakable force in the aftermath of chaos. The faint wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the humid South Carolina night. Red and blue lights flashed against the cracked walls of the Pine Ridge Gas and Go, their beams bouncing off the chrome of the bikers' motorcycles parked outside. Inside the store, chaos was etched across every aisle. Racks of chips toppled, candy scattered, and a cooler door hanging open, its contents spilled across the floor. The bikers lay sprawled and groaning, their earlier bravado replaced by bruises and shame. Staff Sergeant Ryan Cooper stood at the center of it all, his uniform pristine despite the scuffle, his expression calm yet commanding. Around him, his team, Anthony Carter, Jason Gwynn, and Marcus Turner, stood like statues, silent but alert. Their military training kept them poised, even in the aftermath of the fight. The sound of car doors slamming broke the stillness, and a pair of officers entered the store. At the head was Officer Melanie Reyes, her confident stride matching the sharpness in her eyes. A veteran of the Anderson Police Department, Reyes had seen her share of bar brawls and petty criminals. But this scene was different. She took one look at the bikers groaning on the floor, the soldiers standing tall, and the elderly clerk nervously stepping out from behind the counter. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. Before Ryan could answer, Earl, the store's clerk, raised a shaky hand and pointed toward the security camera mounted near the ceiling. "It's all there, officer," he said, his voice firm despite his age. "These boys," he gestured toward the bikers, "came in looking for trouble. The soldiers, they gave them every chance to walk away. They didn't take it." Reyes raised an eyebrow, her attention turning to the bikers. Brick, the leader, was still on the floor, holding his ribs and glaring at Ryan like a wounded animal. Viper muttered curses under his breath, and Tank was sitting against the cooler, his head resting on the glass like he'd just finished a losing marathon. The rest of the bikers weren't much better, bruised, humiliated, and thoroughly defeated. Reyes walked over to the security monitor behind the counter, where Earl had already queued up the footage. She watched in silence as the fight played out on the grainy black and white screen. The bikers were the clear aggressors, their taunts and posturing obvious. But what stood out to her wasn't just the soldiers' precision, it was their restraint. They had dismantled their attackers with an almost surgical efficiency, neutralizing threats without throwing a single unnecessary punch. When the footage ended, Reyes turned back to Ryan, her expression softened by a glimmer of admiration. "You handled that perfectly," she said. "Could have wiped the floor with them, but you didn't. That's real strength." Ryan gave a small nod, his hands resting at his sides. "We didn't want trouble, officer," he said simply. But trouble didn't give us much of a choice. Reyes turned to her partner, who was already cuffing the groaning bikers one by one. Brick resisted for a moment, his pride clearly still smarting, but a sharp glance from Reyes made him think better of it. "You're lucky you're walking out of here in one piece," she muttered as she pulled him to his feet. As the bikers were led out into the night, Earl approached Ryan and his team, holding a fresh cup of coffee. "This one's on the house," he said, his voice tinged with gratitude. "You boys reminded me of my own team back in Nam. We didn't always get the thanks we deserved back then, but I'll be damned if I don't thank you now." Ryan accepted the cup with a nod. "Appreciate it, sir." Reyes paused by the door, watching the soldiers gather their belongings and prepare to leave. "You've got good men here," she said, almost to herself. "The kind of men who remind us what that flag really stands for." Ryan caught her eye as he headed for the door. "That's the job, ma'am." As the soldiers walked out, Earl leaned against the counter, staring at the mess the bikers had left behind. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope, not just for himself, but for the kind of honor that still existed in men like those soldiers. The drive back to Greenville was quiet, the road illuminated by the steady beams of the truck's headlights. The adrenaline from the fight had faded, leaving behind a deep wariness that seeped into Ryan's bones. But as he turned down his familiar neighborhood street, the weight of the night began to lift. The porch light at his house was on, casting a soft glow over the front yard. Through the window, Ryan saw Lauren curled up on the couch, a book in her hands. The sight brought a lump to his throat. How many nights had he dreamed of this moment? How many times had he clung to the thought of home when the chaos of Iraq threatened to swallow him whole? He cut the engine and stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching softly on the driveway gravel. Before he could reach the front door, it burst open, and Chloe came hurtling toward him, her little arms outstretched. "Daddy!" she screamed, her voice high and full of joy. Ryan dropped to one knee just in time to catch her, his arms wrapping around her small frame. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair as the tension of the evening melted away. Chloe giggled, pulling back just enough to look at him. "You're really home," she exclaimed, her small fingers touching the U.S. flag patch on his shoulder. "You didn't forget it." "Of course not," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promised I'd bring it back." Lauren appeared in the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. She walked toward them slowly, almost as if afraid the moment would vanish if she moved too quickly. When Ryan stood, Chloe still in his arms, Lauren wrapped them both in an embrace, her sobs muffled against his chest. "You're home," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Finally," Ryan replied, kissing the top of her head. "I'm finally home." They stood like that for a long moment, the three of them wrapped in each other's warmth, the world outside their small circle fading into insignificance. Later that night, as Chloe slept soundly in her room, Ryan sat on the couch with Lauren, her head resting on his shoulder. He thought about the bikers, the fight, the tension that had gripped him so tightly just hours before. But here, with his family beside him, none of it seemed to matter. "Did something happen tonight?" Lauren asked softly, sensing his lingering thoughts. Ryan kissed her forehead and gave a small smile. "Nothing that matters anymore," he said. And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. At the Pine Ridge Gas and Go, a small crowd of curious locals had gathered outside. Earl, the elderly clerk, stood behind the counter, his weathered hands arranging cups of coffee for a group of veterans who had come to see him after hearing about the incident. The sign above the counter was new, its bold letters reading, "Veterans always welcome. Free coffee." Earl had put it up the day after the fight, a quiet tribute to the soldiers who had reminded him what courage and honor truly looked like. As he poured a cup for a visiting Vietnam vet, Earl replayed the security footage on his phone for the umpteenth time. The old man's voice swelled with pride as he narrated the events. "See there? That's when Brick tried to grab the flag patch. And right there, look at how that soldier, Cooper, moves. Didn't even break a sweat. Man knows what he's doing." The story had taken on a life of its own. Clips of the fight, taken from Earl's security footage, had gone viral. In the footage, the soldiers' restraint stood out above all else. Their precise, measured movements contrasted starkly with the bikers' wild swings and chaotic aggression. The online commentary was filled with praise for the soldiers' discipline, many calling it a masterclass in de-escalation and restraint. Meanwhile, the consequences for the Iron Fangs SC were swift and unforgiving. The gang's leadership publicly denounced Brick, Tank, Viper, and the others involved in the incident. "Their actions don't represent what we stand for," the club's president said in a local news interview. But the damage was already done. Brick and his crew faced multiple charges, including assault and weapons violations. Viper's parole was revoked, ensuring he wouldn't see freedom again anytime soon. The incident became a cautionary tale for bullies who thought they could intimidate anyone they pleased. For the local community, it became something more, a story about the power of discipline and quiet strength. At the Greenville VFW, the story was retold with a mix of awe and admiration. The veterans gathered around tables, nodding and smiling as they discussed the soldiers' restraint and skill. "Cooper didn't have to hold back," one older man said, his voice tinged with respect. "But he did. That's what makes it real strength. Knowing you can take someone down, but choosing not to, unless you absolutely have to." Another veteran leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. That flag patch on his uniform? He didn't just wear it. He lived it. That's the kind of soldier we need more of. Ryan Cooper's name became synonymous with quiet heroism, a reminder of the ideals that so many had fought for: the courage to protect, the wisdom to restrain, and the strength to stand tall in the face of adversity. At home, Ryan was blissfully unaware of the story's growing reach. For him, the fight at the gas station was already a distant memory. What mattered was the present, the soft glow of the living room lamp, the sound of Chloe's giggles, and the comforting presence of Lauren beside him. Ryan sat on the couch, his daughter perched on his lap, her tiny fingers tracing the worn edges of the U.S. flag patch on his uniform. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Does this mean you're a hero, Daddy?" she asked. Ryan hesitated, his throat tightening. "No, baby," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It means I promised to protect people. It means I promised to do the right thing, even when it's hard." Chloe tilted her head, considering his words. Like at the gas station? Lauren, who had been sitting quietly beside them, gave Ryan's arm a gentle squeeze. She hadn't pried about the details of the fight, but she knew enough to understand that Ryan had done what he always did, acted with honor and integrity. "Yeah," Ryan said after a moment, his voice thick. "Like at the gas station." Chloe smiled, her fingers still lingering on the patch. "I like it," she said simply. "It's my favorite part of your uniform." Ryan pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Mine too," he whispered. Lauren leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. "Not just for what you did, but for who you are." Ryan closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. For a moment, the weight of everything, months of deployment, the tension of the fight, the burden of always trying to be more than what the world expected of him, melted away. It wasn't the viral videos or the praise from strangers that mattered. It wasn't even the admiration of the veteran community. What mattered was here, in this room, in the quiet warmth of his family's love. As the evening wore on and Chloe drifted to sleep in his arms, Ryan looked down at the flag patch one last time. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a promise to stand tall, to protect, to embody everything the flag represented, not just for himself, but for Chloe, for Lauren, and for every person who believed in the strength of quiet, disciplined heroes. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt at peace. What do you think about this story? Do you believe the soldiers handled the situation the right way, or would you have done something differently in their place? How would you react if faced with the same kind of intimidation and disrespect? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this intense and thought-provoking encounter. Thank you for watching and inspiring us.